Today, we're going to answer the age-old question of whether or not color film is racist. Welcome back to Overexposed, where not even I am bold enough to start this video off with a joke. Kodak introduced Kodachrome all the way back in 1935. This was a revolutionary breakthrough for film photography because for the first time, families all over the world were able to capture their memories in vivid color. And while color photography began all the way back in the 1800s, it wasn't until the 1930s with Kodachrome that it became more widespread. All of these films had different color layers, and as light would pass through the film, it would record the data on each individual color layer, allowing them to be recombined to create a color image. Developing these pictures is a science, and the science needed to be calibrated to ensure that you got the best results. The calibration at that time was focused on film photography's biggest clients, white families. And that brings us to a discussion of Kodak's Shirley card. The Shirley card was based on a Kodak employee named Shirley Page. Kodak, in their infinite wisdom, believed that this image of Shirley Page, her white skin against a pale background, represented the absolute perfect photograph. Kodak plastered this image and Shirley's winning smile onto a card along with a number of color blocks to help labs when they were developing color film to make sure that the images came out right. It was through this card and through that lens that we now look back and view these photographs and view history. Successfully capturing darker skin tones in film photography has been a challenge ever since the start of color film, the first and foremost reason being the lack of film's dynamic range. And most photographers and photo enthusiasts trace this issue back to about the 1940s, and this is when Kodak created the Shirley card. And that's when labs were utilizing that card as the standard for their development. It was thanks to this card that racial bias was injected into film photography. While the standard that Kodak had put forth served one major market, it left behind many others. This has had an effect on the way that skin tones appear in photography, especially at the time, and there's been a lasting impact that's been felt ever since. It was how Shirley looked in comparison to a customer's photos that determined whether the light and color in the image were right. And there wasn't only one Shirley card. Kodak actually created a number of Shirley cards over the years, and I'm going to post as many of them as I can find on the internet here for you to see. But no matter how many years that passed and no matter how many iterations of this card that Kodak produced, there was one common denominator. It was that Shirley was always white. And because film photography was prevalent even into the 2000s, Kodak relied on these Shirley cards for years. The racial bias in color photography was especially evident early on, and this was because of the early color films and their makeup, Kodachrome being the most prevalent. It was, after all, a slide film. Slide films are notorious for having a very thin dynamic range. So if a lab overexposes or underexposes an image by just a little, it can have a significant impact on the way the image comes out. And let's not forget, the Shirley card was created during a time of tremendous segregation in the United States. I know this may be foreign to some folks from outside of the United States that may be watching. The United States didn't have Brown v. Board of Education until 1954. There was a Supreme Court case that finally, after many years of strife, desegregated United States public school. And what was Kodak doing? Kodak was sending the message that white is normal, white is good, white is the standard. Make no mistake, families of all ethnic backgrounds used cameras at the time. But with Shirley being the standard, many folks had a hard time capturing good-looking images due to that faulty standard being used at the time. The skin tones of Black, Hispanic, or Asian families didn't receive the same sort of consideration in the lab that white families did. The darker the skin tone, the more invisible the subject looked. And getting back to that point about dynamic range, when you would have a black person and a white person in an image, the lab would develop the image for the white person. A few years ago, from an NPR interview, they actually interviewed Jim Line, who was a photographer at the time and who actually joined Kodak to work for a while, specifically in the tech divisions and the research lab. He stated in his interview to NPR that even at the time, Kodak realized that there was a problem with the all-white Shirley card. He stated at the time that he started integrating black models into this testing, and he said that trend caught on pretty quickly within Kodak. He stated, "It wasn't a big deal, it just seemed like the right thing to do." He went on to say, "I wasn't trying to be politically correct." Kodak, as it turned out, had heard these complaints. From a New York Times article, Dr. Loma Roth, a communication studies professor at Concordia University, stated that she had spoken to the former head of Kodak's color studios, Earl Cage. Cage had said that oftentimes Kodak had received complaints from families specifically relating to graduation photos, where there would oftentimes be friend groups from all different ethnicities, as is understandable, and the families weren't happy with the way their images came out and reproduced the darker skin tones. Almost unbelievably, it wasn't those complaints that led to Kodak making the change to the Shirley card. It was actually complaints from chocolate companies and furniture companies who wanted the darker brown skin tones to be rendered properly. Go figure. Apparently, chocolate companies were really ticked off when customers couldn't distinguish between dark chocolate and milk chocolate in their advertisements. It seemed like Kodak finally took action when their commercial interests were at stake. But over time, Kodak eventually attempted to right the wrongs of the Shirley card, and by the 1980s, they were introducing films that had a much wider latitude, a much wider dynamic range, and possessed the ability to capture darker subjects with more accuracy. In fact, with Kodak Gold Max, when they introduced that film, they actually produced an advertisement capturing a very dark horse against a very light background, touting the film's ability to render this image properly. And Kodak went on to introduce a multiracial Shirley card in the 1990s. This Shirley card had 3 models: an Asian woman, a white woman, and a black woman. Seems like such an easy fix. It seems like such an easy fix that should have been done earlier. Kodak would later go on to add a Hispanic woman to the chart as well. And as time went on and photography advanced, the need for the Shirley card would vanish almost entirely. The onset of digital photography has made the Shirley card almost irrelevant. With digital's ability to capture a wide dynamic range and the ability to change the lighting and color in an image with just a few clicks on the computer, most of these problems have now been solved. The rapid advance of technology hasn't been without its faults, though. For example, a recent controversy involving the greatest gymnast of all time, Simone Biles, and world-renowned photographer Annie Leibovitz. Miss Leibovitz came under criticism for her usage of color in those images. Contrast that with these images of Viola Davis from Vanity Fair. The results show that darker skin tones can be rendered in a number of different ways. That's the history of racial bias in film photography. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Kodak Shirley cards are. And if you enjoyed this video about controversies involving Kodak, take a look at this video where I talk about Kodak recently raising prices again. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.